Part 1. The Armor. The neighborhood of Riverside, California, in the summer of 2019, was a place where the line between childhood and criminality had long ago blurred into invisibility. The streets were named after trees: maple, oak, elm, names that suggested pastoral tranquility, but the reality was something far different. This was a community where the sound of sirens had become as familiar as birdsong, where police presence was constant but ineffective, where the absence of genuine opportunity had been replaced by the presence of very real danger. It was in this landscape that Jamal Torres and Marcus Dice Richardson had grown up together. They were not born into the streets. They had been delivered there by circumstance, by economics, by the simple accident of being born to families that had nothing to give them but love, and love, as it turned out, was not enough to compete with hunger. They met in elementary school, two boys who recognized in each other a mirror of their own desperation. By high school, they had become inseparable, the kind of friends whose bond seemed forged in something deeper than mere companionship. They were brothers in everything but blood, and in many ways that bond was stronger. By the time they were 17, both Jamal and Dice had made the choice that so many young men in their neighborhood made. They had joined the West Side Crips, one of the oldest and most entrenched gang organizations in the city. It was not a dramatic conversion, not a moment of conscious decision where they stood at a moral crossroads and chose the darker path. It was more subtle than that, more insidious. It was the gradual erosion of alternatives, the slow realization that the gang offered something nothing else could: protection, identity, purpose, and most importantly, a family that would never abandon you. Jamal was the taller of the two, with a sharp, angular face and eyes that held the kind of intelligence that could have carried him anywhere. He was quick-witted, strategic, and possessed a charisma that drew people to him naturally. In another life, in a different neighborhood, he might have been a leader in legitimate contexts, a teacher, a mentor, a force for positive change. But Riverside did not offer that version of the future to boys like him. Instead, his intelligence and charisma were channeled into the hierarchy of the gang, where he had risen to become a lieutenant, someone trusted with responsibility and respect. Dice was different, shorter, more muscular, with a perpetual expression that oscillated between a grin and a smirk. Where Jamal was calculated, Dice was impulsive. Where Jamal thought 3 moves ahead, Dice acted in the moment. They balanced each other. Jamal's strategy tempered by Dice's willingness to take risks, Dice's boldness channeled through Jamal's tactical thinking. Together, they had become one of the most formidable teams in the gang, known for their efficiency and their loyalty to each other above all else. The summer of that year had been particularly violent. Gang tensions were escalating, and the West Side Crips were engaged in an ongoing territorial dispute with a rival organization, the North Side Bloods. 3 bodies had already fallen to this conflict, each death demanding retaliation, each retaliation creating the necessity for further revenge. It was a cycle that had been spinning since before Jamal and Dice were born, and it showed no signs of slowing down. The incident. The evening of July 19th was hot and still, the kind of night where the air itself seemed to press down on the city, heavy with tension and the weight of accumulated rage. Jamal and Dice were in the parking lot of a convenience store on Mitchell Street, a location that served as an informal gathering place for gang members and others affiliated with the street life. The store's fluorescent lights cast a sickly yellow glow across the asphalt, and a cluster of young men, most of them wearing red or blue, stood in loose groups, unified by neighborhood rather than by any explicit moment of togetherness. At approximately 9:30 p.m., a call came through to the Riverside Police Department. Someone had reported a possible gang gathering, and officers were dispatched to the location. It was a routine response to a routine call, the kind of police presence that had become so normalized in neighborhoods like Riverside that it barely registered as an event worth noting. 2 patrol cars arrived at the scene with lights off, a tactical choice designed to catch gang members before they could disperse. Officers exited their vehicles with a practiced efficiency. Their presence immediately commanded the attention of everyone in the parking lot. This was the moment where things could go multiple directions, where the encounter could remain civil, where compliance could prevent escalation, or where the spark of disrespect could ignite something far larger than anyone anticipated. Jamal and Dice were standing near a late-model sedan, ostensibly discussing something mundane, though the officers could not have known what. As the police approached, most of the other young men began to move away, recognizing the implicit threat in the presence of law enforcement. But Jamal and Dice stood their ground, a choice that was not necessarily defiant, but was certainly not deferential. The lead officer, a man named Garrett Walsh, was a veteran of 12 years on the force. He had seen countless iterations of this exact scene, and he had learned to read the dynamics almost instantly. He could see in Jamal's posture a certain confidence that suggested prior experience with police encounters, a familiarity with the choreography of arrest and interrogation. He could see in Dice's expression a combative energy barely contained beneath the surface. "Gentlemen, we're going to need to see some identification." This was the moment. This was the point where Jamal could have simply complied, where the entire evening could have taken a different trajectory. He had been stopped by police before. He knew the drill: provide identification, answer basic questions, and wait for the officers to either find probable cause or move on to other concerns. It was a system that was both predictable and survivable. But something inside Jamal had shifted over the preceding weeks. The violence that had dominated the summer had begun to affect him in subtle ways. He had seen death at close range. He had participated in acts that society classified as serious felonies, but that within the gang context were simply understood as necessary. He had begun to internalize a certain narrative about himself and his position in the world, that he was untouchable, that his status within the gang insulated him from real consequences, and that the system that ruled ordinary society did not apply to someone like him. "Why?" Jamal asked, his tone calm but weighted with implicit disrespect. "We're just standing here. We're not doing anything." It was a small act of defiance, but in the context of a police encounter, it functioned as a significant provocation. The officer's face hardened almost imperceptibly. "Because I asked," Walsh said. "Now, identification, now." Jamal exchanged a glance with Dice, and in that glance was the entire architecture of their relationship, a shared understanding, a mutual recognition of the moment they were inhabiting. Dice's expression shifted slightly, and Jamal understood that his friend was looking to him for guidance, waiting to see how far he was willing to push this. Jamal reached into his pocket with deliberate slowness, and the officers immediately tightened, their hands moving toward their belts, the encounter escalating in the space of a heartbeat from routine to potentially dangerous. Jamal withdrew his wallet and extracted his ID, but instead of handing it directly to the officer, he held it at arm's length, forcing Walsh to step forward to retrieve it. As the officer took the identification, Jamal's lips curved into a smile. It was not a smile of friendliness or compliance. It was the smile of someone who believed himself to be operating under a different set of rules, someone who was convinced that the system could not touch him. "You know what's funny?" Jamal said, his voice steady and contemptuous. "You all come around here like you actually matter, like you have any real power. But we know how this works. You stop us, you write us a citation maybe, and we walk. You can't do anything to me that the streets haven't already done worse." The other officer, a younger man named Deshaun Carter, stepped forward, his jaw tightening at the blatant disrespect being displayed. But Walsh raised a hand, halting him. Walsh had been doing this long enough to understand that sometimes the best response to provocation was a measured patience. He examined Jamal's ID, running his eyes over the details,
and then looked back at the teenager before him. Jamal Torres, age 17. No current warrants, but you've been picked up 4 times in the last 18 months. Assault, possession with intent, and 2 counts of disturbing the peace. All dismissed, Jamal countered, his confidence apparent in every syllable. Yes, they were, but they're part of a pattern, aren't they? A pattern that suggests you're someone who hasn't learned the value of compliance. Jamal reached out and tapped Walsh on the chest with his index finger, a gesture that was at once trivial and, within the context of police encounters, deeply transgressive. You don't get to talk to me like I'm some scared kid. I know my rights, and I know that you need probable cause to detain me, which you don't have. So either you charge me with something or you let me walk. Walsh's face remained.
The decision to contact law enforcement was not made impulsively. Dice spent 2 weeks wrestling with the implications of what he was considering. To betray Jamal would mean betraying the gang. To betray the gang would mean becoming a target, would mean that at any moment someone could find him and kill him, could end his life as punishment for his disloyalty. These were not abstract concerns or theoretical possibilities. These were documented facts of the reality he inhabited. He thought about his mother. He thought about the conversations they had had when he was younger, about her dreams for him to be something other than what he had become. He thought about the fear in her eyes when police came to the house asking questions. He thought about the funeral he had just attended and the impossible grief of David Chen's mother. And he thought about Jamal and what he understood with increasing certainty, that his best friend was going to be caught, that the law was going to close in on him with the relentless inevitability of gravity, and that when it did, Jamal would fall very hard, and he would fall alone. Dice had a cousin, a man named Raymond, who had left gang life behind 4 years earlier. Raymond worked as a community counselor for a nonprofit that helped at-risk youth. He was one of the few people Dice knew who had successfully extricated himself from the gang structure and lived to talk about it. Dice contacted him. "I need to talk to someone," Dice said when they met at a coffee shop across town, away from their neighborhood where they might be recognized. "Someone in law enforcement. But I need guarantees." Raymond listened as Dice explained what he knew. And then he made a series of phone calls to people he knew in the system. Social workers, probation officers, people who worked at the intersection of community and criminal justice. Eventually, he was connected with a detective named Sarah Vance, who had spent 8 years working gang-related homicides and who had a reputation for taking seriously the concerns of people who wanted to exit gang life. Detective Vance met with Dice on neutral ground at a state park outside the city, a location that minimized the risk of them being seen together. She was a woman in her late 40s, with gray beginning to appear in her dark hair, and she had the kind of eyes that had seen things that would have broken lesser people. She listened to everything Dice had to say, without interruption. What Dice provided was not a complete picture of everything Jamal had done, but it was enough. He placed Jamal at the scene of a particular shooting, a homicide that law enforcement was actively investigating. He provided details that only someone who had been present would know. He provided information about gang members who had been involved in organized violence, about supply chains for weapons, about the hierarchy of decision-making within the organization. "Why are you telling me this?" Vance asked when Dice had finished. "Because someone has to stop it," Dice said quietly. "Because my friend is going to die or go to prison, and I can't watch that happen and do nothing. Because kids like David Chen should still be alive. You understand what will happen to you if this becomes public, if word gets out that you cooperated with law enforcement." "Yes," Dice said. "And you're willing to accept that?" Dice nodded, though the fear in his eyes suggested that he was not nearly as certain as he was trying to appear. Over the following 3 weeks, Dice met with Vance multiple times.
He provided detailed information that allowed detectives to build a circumstantial case against Jamal for his role in the gang's violent activities. He identified other members who had been involved in specific incidents. He drew maps and explained hierarchies, and explained the strategic logic behind various gang decisions. The police moved methodically. They cross-referenced Dice's information with physical evidence. They interviewed witnesses separately to see if their stories aligned with what Dice had told them. They examined phone records and security camera footage. They built a case that was circumstantial but solid, a structure of interconnected facts that all pointed to Jamal's involvement in organized criminal activity. On August 28th, law enforcement executed a series of coordinated arrests across the city. 23 members of the West Side Crips were taken into custody, including Jamal Torres. He was arrested at his apartment at 6:15 in the morning, removed from his bed and handcuffed by detectives who showed him no particular mercy or kindness. He was transported to a police station downtown and placed in an interrogation room where he would spend the next 16 hours answering questions about his involvement in gang violence. He did not know, in those early hours, that it was Dice who had provided the information that led to his arrest. That revelation would come later through the typical channels of information that existed within the gang structure, through whispers and phone calls and messages passed between inmates in holding cells. Detective Vance and her partner, a man named James Morrison, entered the interrogation room where Jamal was waiting. Jamal was sitting at a metal table, his hands cuffed in front of him, his face carefully arranged into an expression of studied indifference. But there was something different about him in this context, something that suggested that the armor of confidence he had worn so successfully in other situations was less effective in this one. Jamal Torres, you're 27 years old. You have the right to remain silent. You have the right to an attorney. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Do you understand your rights? Jamal nodded, but said nothing. I need verbal confirmation, Vance said. Yeah, I understand my rights, Jamal said, his voice carrying a trace of its former confidence, though it was noticeably diminished. And I want a lawyer. You're entitled to a lawyer, Vance agreed, and we'll make sure that happens. But before we do that, I want to talk to you about something. I want to tell you what we know, and then I want to give you an opportunity to help yourself. I'm not saying anything without my lawyer, Jamal repeated. Vance nodded, as if she had expected this exact response. She pulled out a file folder and placed it on the table between them. Inside were photographs, surveillance footage from various locations, forensic evidence, documents. She opened it slowly, allowing Jamal to see the contents. On July 12th, there was a robbery at a convenience store on Martin Luther King Boulevard. The victim was seriously injured. 3 people witnessed the robbery. They all identified you from a photo array. They also identified Marcus Richardson as being present at the scene. She turned a page. On July 29th, there was a shooting in the parking lot of Webster Elementary School. 1 person was hit, a 17-year-old named Anthony Simmons. He's going to recover, but the bullet came within an inch of hitting his spine. We have security footage that places you at the location at the time of the shooting. We have phone records showing that you received multiple calls from numbers associated with gang members in the hour preceding the shooting. Another page turned. On August 3rd, there was a homicide. Jerome Patterson, shot 12 times in broad daylight. We have testimony placing you at a location where you were discussing retaliation for that shooting. And we have additional testimony identifying you as having approved the specific individuals who would be targeted. Jamal's face had gone pale. He was beginning to understand the scope of what was being presented to him. And, Vance continued quietly, we have a detailed statement from someone who was present during multiple conversations about gang activity. Someone who was there. Someone you trusted. She did not say Dice's name. She did not need to. Jamal understood immediately who it was, and the realization seemed to strike him like a physical blow. His hands, which had been resting on the table, balled into fists. "That's bullshit," Jamal said, but there was no strength behind it. You didn't what?" Vance asked. "You didn't participate in gang violence? Because we have documentation that suggests otherwise. You didn't make decisions that resulted in people's deaths? Because we have testimony that places you in conversations where those decisions were being made." She leaned back in her chair, studying him. "Here's what I want to tell you, Jamal. You're 17. You're still a juvenile. That matters in terms of how the system treats you. If you cooperate with us now, if you help us understand the full scope of what happened, we can talk to the district attorney about that. We can make a case that you were young, that you were influenced by peer pressure and gang culture, that you're capable of rehabilitation. Or we can proceed without your cooperation. We have a very strong case against you. The physical evidence is solid, the eyewitness testimony is corroborated, and we have a detailed confession from someone who was in the gang with you, someone who knows everything you've done." She pulled out another document. "This is a list of the charges we're going to file if you don't cooperate. Armed robbery, assault with a deadly weapon, gang participation, conspiracy to commit murder, and 3 separate murder charges related to deaths that resulted directly from gang decisions you participated in making." Jamal stared at the document, and something inside him seemed to collapse. "I want my lawyer," he said again, but this time it was a whisper. Vance stood up and Morrison exited the room to arrange for an attorney to be provided, but before she left, she leaned down close to Jamal.
After 3 weeks of testimony, the case went to the judge for determination. Jamal's attorney had argued for juvenile treatment, for the possibility of rehabilitation in the juvenile system. The prosecutor had argued that the severity of his crimes, his lack of remorse, and his position of leadership within the gang organization made him unsuitable for juvenile facilities, and that he should be tried as an adult. Judge Robert Chen considered the evidence for 3 days before issuing his ruling. He found that Jamal Torres, despite his age, had engaged in sophisticated criminal activity that demonstrated both planning and a callous disregard for human life. He found that Jamal had been a leader within the gang, that his decisions had directly resulted in injuries and deaths, and that the juvenile system was inadequate to address the scope and severity of his crimes. Jamal was transferred to adult court. The trial in adult court was shorter but more brutal. The evidence was essentially the same: physical evidence, eyewitness testimony, Dice's detailed account of gang operations, and Jamal's leadership role. But adult court allowed for more serious charges and more severe penalties. Jamal was convicted on multiple counts: armed robbery, assault with a deadly weapon, conspiracy to commit murder, and 2 counts of second-degree murder for his role in deaths that resulted from gang decisions he had participated in making. At sentencing, Judge Chen stated that while Jamal was only 17 years old, his actions had been those of someone far older, far more calculating, and far more willing to embrace moral vacancy than age alone could explain. He sentenced Jamal to 32 years in state prison, with the possibility of parole after 25 years. When the sentence was read, Jamal did not react visibly. He simply sat at the defense table, his face unreadable, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the judge, beyond the courtroom, beyond the reality of what was happening to him. But later, when he was being led out of the courtroom to be transported back to the detention facility and then eventually to the state prison system, he looked at Dice one final time. There was no anger in the look, no hatred, no plea for forgiveness. There was only a profound emptiness, an understanding of the trajectory of his life and the role that his own choices, and his best friend's choice, had played in determining it. The aftermath.
Dice's cooperation with law enforcement was instrumental in prosecuting not only Jamal, but also in dismantling significant portions of the gang structure. 14 other gang members were convicted based on evidence that Dice had provided or that had resulted from investigations that his testimony had prompted. He enrolled in a community college program while still in protective custody, completing his GED and taking introductory courses in criminal justice and psychology. He was interested, he said, in understanding why people made the choices they made, in comprehending the decision points that led someone toward violence or toward reformation. When he was finally released from protective custody after 2 years, he went to work with a nonprofit organization similar to the one his cousin worked for, helping young men at risk of gang involvement find alternative paths. He spoke at community centers and high schools about his experience, about the consequences of gang participation, about the cost of loyalty misplaced. He never spoke badly of Jamal. He never used his former friend as a cautionary tale or a symbol of failure. Instead, he spoke about the possibility of choice, about the moments when someone could walk toward something better, about the difficulty of stepping away from the people and the identity that had been forged in the fires of shared deprivation.